Welcome, everyone. I'm Gwen Taraska, the Director of the Climate Program at Ocean Conservancy, and we're really pleased to have you here for this discussion on the ambitious climate action that we need to see in 2021, as well as the role of ocean-based solutions. While folks are logging in, we have a quick poll to just sort of get a sense of who's joining us for the discussion today, and that should be showing up in your screen shortly. Three quick pieces of housekeeping before we get started. First, if anyone has tech issues during the event, please contact Cody Sullivan, who is our climate communications lead and will be running the platform behind the scenes during the event. And he'll be sharing his contact information in the chat. Second, and also in the chat, we'll be sharing some hashtags that are relevant to the discussion today, as well as the handles of our speakers, in case anyone would like to discuss these issues on social media during or after the event. And third, we have some links to materials on ocean-based climate solutions in case they might be helpful for background. And then we will be opening up the chat function as well as the Q&A function during the panel discussion, so everyone can sort of participate as fully as we can manage during a virtual discussion. We are extremely pleased and grateful to have with us Representative Kathy Castor, the chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, to share her vision for U.S. climate action, including ocean climate action. Representative Castor started her professional career enforcing environmental and growth management laws to protect Florida's coastlines and wetlands and endangered species. And she's now, of course, a national climate leader representing Florida's 14th district with a very long track record of promoting a clean and healthy environment, advancing clean energy jobs, building climate resilience, and supporting environmental justice. So thank you so much, Representative Castor, for being with us, and you have the floor.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Gwen, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Janice, and everyone at Ocean Conservancy. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I want to thank everyone on this Zoom link for your advocacy. It is more important than ever. I'd like to start out by saying that I know we are all praying for communities out west in the grips of wildfires. It's simply all too real. The evidence of intensifying climate impacts. So I'm particularly grateful to all of you who are focused on climate solutions. My love for a vibrant and healthy Gulf of Mexico and natural Florida inspired my public service. I was born in Miami and raised in Tampa, and I've served in the House now for over 10 years, representing my coastal Tampa Bay community on Florida's Gulf Coast. And when Democrats won the majority, the last election, Speaker Pelosi asked me to lead a new House Select Committee on the climate crisis. We have some fantastic ocean champions, by the way, with Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, Oregon, Congressman Jared Huffman from California, and a fantastic professional staff who many of you all may know, Anna Unruh-Cohen as our staff director, Allison Cassidy, Samantha Medlock, Kenzie Landa, all fighting for healthy and clean oceans. So the speaker charged our committee, first and foremost, to follow the science and develop an ambitious, actionable roadmap for Congress to tackle climate change. Our committee met with over 1,000 stakeholders. We held 17 hearings, including one, our kickoff hearing with the youth climate leaders from across America. And we reviewed over 700 proposals from our public requests for information. So thank you, Ocean Conservancy, for helping us along, and to the other folks out there who suggested climate solutions to our committee. It all culminated with a sweeping action plan that we released earlier this summer. The Solving the Climate Crisis Action Plan is a 500+ page roadmap for Congress to reduce pollution, to protect our ocean, and chart a course for a healthy, resilient, and just America. One journalist called our climate action plan the most detailed and well thought out plan for addressing climate change that has ever been part of US politics. So I recommend it to you. You can find it at climatecrisis.house.gov. If you don't have time for all 500 pages, we have a terrific executive summary. But much of our plan involves protecting our ocean and maximizing its climate benefits. And as a lifelong Floridian, I understand how important the ocean is to the economies of communities all across America. Whether your business is rooted in tourism or fishing, boating, diving, the economic well-being of my community and many others is tied to clean water and clean beaches. Folks from around the world come to explore our coral reefs, enjoy our beautiful beaches, and support our small businesses that line the coastlines. But our way of life is increasingly threatened by climate change. Warmer temperatures are threatening the health of our ocean. They're causing ocean acidification and producing harmful algal blooms. They're leading to declines in biodiversity and shifting fish stocks. So as we work on protecting our communities and building a more resilient America, we must protect the ocean and value its climate benefits. How do we do that? Here are some of the solutions we laid out in our action plan. To solve the crisis, we need to set ambitious and achievable goals and targets. So first and foremost, following the science, we know that we need to achieve 100% net zero clean energy as soon as possible, but no later than 2050. We also set another very important key target, and that is 30 by 30. That is protecting at least 30% of our coast and ocean by 2030. To get there, we need to do a few things. For example, we have to increase, expand, and diversify our marine protected areas. We have to invest in coastal protection and restoration programs at the federal, state, and tribal levels, as well as partner with the private sector to do so. We need to stop the EPA and other federal agencies from destroying our valuable wetlands and weakening safeguards like the Waters of the United States rule. And we have to prohibit new offshore oil and gas leases in any area of the outer continental shelf. Those are some of the basic ways to protect the ocean, but there are also some more specific challenges. For example, we recommend that Congress do more to address ocean acidification and harmful algal blooms. How? Through smart investments. We need better funding across the board for research, monitoring, forecasting, mitigation, adaptation, all of this to improve the health and resilience of our ocean and the wetland ecosystem. That way we can curb ocean acidification and harmful algal blooms and keep our economy healthy too. As we talk about climate action, we cannot forget about our fisheries and fishing communities. It's time we incorporate them into climate adaptation, into fisheries management, to help folks maintain fish stocks in the face of rising ocean temperatures. Solving the climate crisis is also about resilience and adaptation. Many climate plans that you'll read about focus only on how we reduce carbon pollution, how we make the important transition to the clean energy economy. But our report is probably the most detailed and impactful ever presented to the US Congress when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. And we're going to need your help to implement, get a lot of our recommendations hammered out into legislation and enacted into law. So on the resilience and adaptation front, we propose that Congress dramatically increase investments in natural infrastructure along our coasts, prioritizing nature-based infrastructure wherever it's appropriate. And we must transform our energy system too. We've got to ramp up renewables. Congress must scale up ocean-based renewable and marine energy while making sure we are minimizing the impacts to wildlife, fisheries, and ocean ecosystems. Finally, it's really important that we unite behind the science. We've seen how harmful it can be for all Americans when the government ignores experts, denies science, and does not believe in the objective data. To that end, our report recommends that Congress increase its support for research, data collection, and mapping of blue carbon ecosystems. And before we move on to today's panel, I'd like to stress the urgency of this crisis. I know you all understand that, but all we have to do is look across the West, the wildfires. Look what is happening with these storms in my neck of the woods that, what letter are we on the alphabet now? We're in the midst of the busiest hurricane season in recorded history. Lake Charles, Louisiana is dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Laura, which was a Category 4. It intensified so quickly into a Cat 4 because the waters of the Gulf of Mexico are so overheated. So as we grapple with the harsh impacts of the climate crisis, this unprecedented public health crisis, the COVID pandemic, complicates our ability to respond and safely evacuate families. Our report makes recommendations for preparedness and disaster recovery as well. But the time for climate action is now. And today you'll hear from some amazing leaders who have devoted their lives to climate solutions. They've devoted their lives to climate solutions, but these are experts particularly in the role of our ocean in solving the climate crisis. So again, I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to the Ocean Conservancy. Help us take our action plan and hammer it out into law so that we can meet the moral obligation that we have to our kids and future generations. Thanks, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Representative Castor. It's just heartening to hear about the climate policies that the Select Committee has teed up, especially today as we're looking at some pretty horrific climate impacts across the country. We're now going to turn to the panel and open the chat and the Q&A function. So you can use the chat if you have any comments to share with the entire group. But if you have any questions for the panelists, please do enter those, not in the chat, but in the Q&A function, along with your name and your affiliation. And we'll then be able to unmute you after the panel so that you can ask your question live. So let me now turn it to Anne Merwin, our Vice President for Conservation, who will be moderating the panel and introducing the speakers. Anne, over to you.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Representative Castor, for those compelling remarks. We certainly have a big and ambitious agenda for us, and I'm really excited to be here today with this terrific panel of ocean and climate experts to really dig into some of these solutions more deeply. As Gwen noted, the chat box is now open, so feel free to react and respond as we go along. But if you have a question for the panel, please submit it via the Q&A tool. But before we get started, let me go ahead and introduce our esteemed panel. First, Janice Searles-Jones is the CEO of Ocean Conservancy. Our mission is to use science-based solutions to protect the ocean from today's greatest global challenges. Janice has spoken on the intersection of oceans and climate in venues ranging from the United Nations to Bloomberg Live and the Aspen Ideas Festival. She's an environmental attorney and a respected expert in the marine conservation field whose accomplishments include authoring multiple chapters on the sustainable use of ocean resources, focusing on ecosystem-based management, Pacific fisheries, and other ocean coastal law policy issues. So thank you, Janice, for joining us today. Next is Andres Jimenez. Andres is the executive director of Green 2.0, whose mission is to increase racial diversity amongst environmental organizations. Green 2.0 believes in a powerful, winning environmental movement grounded in equity and inclusion. Previously, Andres served as senior director of government affairs at Citizens Climate Lobby, where he worked with both the House and Senate to advocate for climate legislation, and as associate director of government relations at our very own Ocean Conservancy, where he focused on creating bipartisan solutions for critical issues like ocean acidification and sustainable fisheries in the United States. And last but not least, Sue Jimenez, thank you for joining us as well. Sue is the Senior Fellow for Climate Change at the United Nations Foundation. For more than 25 years, Sue served as the lead climate lawyer for the US State Department. In that capacity, she played a central role in all major international climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement on climate change. In addition, during her tenure at the State Department, she also supervised the Treaty Office and issues related to law of the sea and led the State Department's Office for Oceans, Environment, and Science. That is an impressive group of experts. We are thrilled to have you all with us. And thank you again for joining us. Why don't we just go ahead and jump right into the questions. Sue, why don't we start with you? With the UN General Assembly and Climate Week on the horizon, and with parties to the Paris Agreements supposed to consider upgrading their emissions target in the short term, let's start at that global scale. It seems that the world is starting to break down the silos between ocean and climate issues internationally, including to bring the power of the ocean, including ocean-based climate solutions, to the larger climate effort. Sue, can you give us some examples of the breaking down of those silos that you're starting to see happening?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Can you hear me okay? Well, as you say, the international approaches to climate change on the one hand and the ocean on the other have historically not been very well connected. You know, an ocean meeting was an ocean meeting, and a climate negotiation was a climate negotiation, and, you know, never the twain shall meet. But I think things are looking up, and I'll give you four examples. First is that there seems to be increasing international awareness of the linkages between climate change and the ocean on both sides of the equation. So the impacts of climate change on the ocean and the ways in which the ocean can actually be part of the solution. I think this was helped in part by the IPCC special report recently that looked at both the ocean and the cryosphere. And I think that kind of penetrated the international consciousness to a certain extent. The second example would be that ocean-related events and negotiations are now tending to include climate components almost as a matter of course. So, for example, if you look at the UN Ocean Conference, which was postponed due to COVID, but if you look at the agenda, it includes a ocean kind of climate adaptation section in relation to the ocean. And if you look at the negotiations on the High Seas Treaty or biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, you see that there are several references to climate change. So, for example, when the parties, now this is all in draft, but notionally, when the parties get together to decide which areas are deserving of being marine protected areas, they're supposed to take into account climate impacts, climate vulnerabilities, in addition to other factors. The third example would be on the climate change side, the climate change regime. Two of the recent presidents of the Conference of the Parties in our world, Fiji and Chile, both made oceans, sort of the ocean climate linkages, top priority, and together helped pull together a group called the Friends of the Ocean and Climate, which is a group of parties, national governments, which are trying to integrate ocean issues much more kind of deeply into the DNA of the climate regime. And for the first time, the climate conference took a decision in Madrid last year to pay more attention, put higher priority on integration issues, both within the climate regime and sort of vis-a-vis ocean regimes. And there's going to be a dialogue this fall, we think, on that exact issue. And my fourth example is the International Maritime Organization. for the longest time, no one was really paying attention to emissions from ships. You know, when I was working on the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997, we sent the issue of marine emissions over to the IMO and kind of nothing happened for a really long time. But just a couple of years ago, 2018, the IMO adopted a greenhouse gas strategy with a couple of long-term global goals in it, but also a kind of mandate to come up with short-term real measures. So I would say those four things give you an indication of how the world has changed fairly recently.
Thanks, Sue. You know, I think that's really encouraging to see that kind of progress at those top levels that can really change the playing field. And I'd like to follow up and ask you a little bit about how we start to implement that. You know, in addition to these big picture breaking down of the silos efforts, are there other things that countries could be doing to promote better ocean climate integration, including any areas where you think the US could really provide some leadership?
Yes. For people who are interested, the Ocean Conservancy paper, which may or may not be in the chat somewhere, highlighted some of these possibilities. Before I get to those, let me just say that I think almost the most important thing that countries can do is to better integrate domestically. I think the US is actually kind of a leader in that regard. The US tends to be, no matter what the administration, pretty well coordinated in terms of issue X and issue Y. Partly it's because they're all in one department, you know, kind of run out of the State Department, so that breeds better coordination. I was quite struck in facilitating some of these international meetings over the last couple of years, how little integration there is in many countries. And I think, you know, you can't really fully integrate internationally if countries are not coordinating domestically. So that's point one. But then in terms of a couple of things that I think could happen, well, in the climate change regime, so I mentioned that there's going to be this dialogue on better integration of ocean and climate, but that, you know, you want to make sure that that's not a one-off that just happens and then goes away. Somehow you need to build in something much more regular into the climate change process. Some have suggested that there be, you know, a dialogue of this nature every 2 years, every 1 year, make it a standing agenda item that needs to be discussed. It sounds silly, like just a procedural thing, but I think it has action forcing, you know, power. When you have something like that, everybody then kind of rallies around that and make sure that they have a good story to tell. So that's one. I think the group of Friends of Climate and the Action could also be a little bolder. You know, a dialogue is one thing, but some of the other issues that could be discussed include whether there should be a new scale for comparing greenhouse gases. So right now, greenhouse gases are compared based on their global warming potential, but they don't really distinguish gases in terms of their potential to acidify the ocean, where, you know, carbon dioxide would sort of come out on top. So one possibility is to start developing that kind of scale to either like supplement or be integrated into the GWP scale. So that's one. The second is countries could take on ocean-specific commitments within the climate change regime. Some countries are already doing that. They're putting ocean-related commitments, whether it's increasing blue carbon or something about offshore renewable energy, into their nationally determined contributions or their adaptation communications under the Paris Agreement. So that's another thing that the world or the United States could do if it rejoins the Paris Agreement. The third is that, so I mentioned that the IMO is in the middle of negotiations. Well, states could take ambitious positions in that negotiation. They're currently looking at ambitious design measures for existing ships and operational measures for all ships. And, you know, if countries were to sort of lean towards the ambitious end of the spectrum, that would be, you know, a way to help both the ocean and the climate. The fourth thing is that you basically need smaller coalitions of either countries or multi-stakeholder initiatives. You know, there's a limit to how much can get done at the global level when everybody has to agree through a consensus process. So I think we basically have to look to smaller groups. I know Ocean Conservancy was quite involved in the development of the Pacific Rim Ocean Climate Alliance, but those are the kinds of things that probably need to raise ambition here and there. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. I think it's a really interesting vision for what the practicalities of an ocean-powered U.S. climate strategy might look like as we're working with the rest of the world to try and tackle what is a global problem. I think we also know that the practical work of implementation is going to depend on what happens back here at home in the US, at least in terms of meeting US commitments once ocean solutions are incorporated into those global facing commitments. And it's clear that there is no single silver bullet that's going to solve the climate crisis, and that we're going to have to be taking action across every sector, including the ocean sector. Janice, let me turn to you now. I know you have been thinking a lot about what the ocean can bring to the table in terms of practical solutions. Can you talk us through some of those and the actions we need to see from the administration and Congress to move them forward, particularly on the mitigation side of the equation?
Yes, absolutely. And I definitely will commend everyone to the excellent select committee report that Representative Castor mentioned, and in the chat as well is our action agenda for a blue-green future, which goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to do here. But I will offer a couple of highlights, and I will also really endorse what Sue said about the silos between the ocean and climate starting to break down, and the ocean being perceived not just as a victim of climate change, but also as a really powerful source for solutions. And that's a really important thing for all of us to embrace and to continue to advance at the federal level in the United States at the same time as we're doing all this international work. So I would focus on three things. The first is reducing emissions from ocean-based industries. And as Representative Castor talked about, oil and gas is obviously on that list. But another really important sector that needs more attention, as Sue talked about a little bit, is shipping and all of its associated infrastructure. So the ports that actually serve global shipping as well. Shipping moves about 90% of global trade by volume, and it is a significant emitter. It emits approximately the amount of Germany's national emissions in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. And it also accounts for a significant and a growing amount of black carbon emissions, which is a really potent, short-lived climate pollutant that has disproportionate impacts in Arctic ecosystems because of reducing the albedo of the sea ice. And so there are community impacts from soot and also broader climate impacts from the ice deposition. So looking at the shipping sector and reducing their emissions rapidly and getting swiftly on a path towards full decarbonization would be a really significant contribution to ocean climate mitigation efforts. And there are immediate steps that we could do now to support those high ambition proposals for greenhouse gas emissions that are already at the International Maritime Organization. And for the United States in particular, we don't have a MERV scheme, a monitoring, reporting, and verification scheme for vessels entering the US EEZ. And that would be an important immediate next step that we could take there. And then I'll also say that the port infrastructure is also a concentrated source of emissions. They're often cited in low-income communities or communities of color that bear a disproportionate impact from pollution. So electrifying ports and the vehicles that are serving ports is another really important priority and something that could be acted on relatively swiftly. So that's sort of ocean-based industry emissions. The flip side of that is supporting ocean-based renewable energy. And so I think we all know that offshore wind is a really critical part of making the rapid transition to clean energy and away from dirtier energy sources. It has well-paying jobs, local jobs. It displaces those dirtier energy sources that have a disproportionate impact on communities of color and other marginalized groups. But right now in the United States, we only have about 16 leases in US waters that are active, and we're only producing about 30 megawatts of production that are installed. And we have much greater targets and much greater need to accelerate that transition to renewables. So there's a lot that can be done at the federal level to get comprehensive planning and a siting strategy in place to think more about what the power transmission is from offshore renewable to onshore, and actually to direct federal agencies to increase deployment of well-sited offshore wind projects. And so that's another thing that we can do relatively quickly that's going to be really important to have that ocean contribution to climate solutions. And then the third, which we've also talked a little bit, is advancing blue carbon storage. Blue carbon systems are seagrasses, salt marshes, mangroves, and on a per acre basis, they sequester a really impressive amount of carbon. but we're still really losing a lot of those blue carbon habitats at a pretty remarkable rate. And it's really important for us to actually maintain what we have, because when we lose those habitats, we release additional carbon dioxide that they sequester. So we really need to do that to get to our climate targets. In the United States, we don't have a consistent federal approach for inventorying, monitoring, and quantifying what those blue carbon ecosystems actually do for us from a climate perspective. And so we're not incorporating their important climate role when we're making those local site-specific decisions that are leading to so much wetland loss, for example. So if we were to adopt a unified approach to blue carbon ecosystem quantification and planning, and actually direct agencies to avoid destroying or degrading blue carbon habitats, that would go a long way towards getting us to a zero net loss, which is where we need to be.
That's ambitious, Janice. So oil and gas, shipping emissions reductions.
We can do it.
Blue carbon and wind. I think we all have our marching orders on that front. You know, that said, I think we also all recognize that regardless of how effective our mitigation strategies are, we're already feeling some serious effects from climate change, and some of that change is already baked in. In the past weeks alone, we've seen impacts from wildfires across the West to rapidly intensifying hurricanes in the Gulf. And along our coast, we've faced impacts ranging from shifting fish populations to sea level rise and ocean acidification. Janice, so can you also talk some about what the federal government can do to help coastal communities and ocean ecosystems build resilience against this overwhelming wave of change that's happening?
Yeah, thanks. We always talk about the need to do mitigation, but also recognize how much we are already facing in terms of adaptation and being realistic about all the adaptation needs that coastal communities are facing right now. So Representative Castor talked a little bit about protecting marine habitats. And that's something that's critically important, not just to help us respond to the biodiversity crisis in the ocean, but research is increasingly showing that marine protected areas actually have a big range of important climate adaptation and mitigation benefits. So that is one tool in our climate policy toolkit that we need to think about deploying strategically and in a way that really thinks about communities, indigenous rights, tribally led marine protection mechanisms, public access opportunities, and providing meaningful opportunities for public and stakeholder engagement. But it's a really important climate tool that we need to think about in the marine space. The second is climate ready fisheries. We already see, if you're a fisherman, if you're in the water, you are already seeing a lot of impacts from climate change. Fish are moving, they're producing fewer offspring, they're smaller, they're less resilient. And we also know that we're also seeing habitat degradation, like corals and kelp forests are also being damaged by climate change. So we have habitat loss, we have fish moving, we have coastal communities that have developed in place to take advantage of abundant fisheries. And now we're seeing those shifts. So we really need to think about how to prepare those communities and how to think about climate ready fisheries and what that looks like. And NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, plays a huge role in helping us think through that in implementing their solutions. And they really need to be doing things right now, like providing practical guidance to fishery managers for how to actually incorporate climate decisions into their fishery management framework, and to really be more supportive of accelerating the use of tools that help us think about potential fisheries changes and outcomes so that we can support those communities that are really seeing sort of the bounty of the sea move away from where they have lived and the places that they have fished for a long time. And then the third is that sort of host of impacts that are affecting coastal communities and that they're already feeling every day. And we've sort of touched on them a little bit, but ocean acidification, coastal water quality, sea level rise. And there's a lot that we can do, really practical, really impactful things that we can do to support coastal communities on that front right now. Increasing ocean acidification research funding, funding improved stormwater and wastewater treatment infrastructure. There are a lot of things that we can do to help those communities plan for future changes and adapt to the changes that have already happened. And I do want to underscore, and we've talked about a little bit, but all of these issues have really significant justice and equity concerns. Communities of color and coastal other marginalized groups, they often bear the brunt of carbon pollution impacts and historically are often left out or overlooked as policymakers are trying to think about solutions. So we really need to challenge ourselves and all of our federal policymakers as we're talking about solutions to do better and to design climate solutions that are both inclusive and equitable. And so that's a very strong emphasis we need to see going forward.
Thanks, Janice. Let me use that last comment as an opportunity to turn to you, Andres. Janice just noted some of the very real environmental justice issues that get raised when we're looking at how we design and implement climate mitigation adaptation solutions. Environmental advocacy groups have long failed to effectively wrestle with these kinds of issues. Andres, what do you think the community needs to do differently to ensure that our climate advocacy is equitable and just?
Yeah, great question, Anne. Thank you so much. And obviously good afternoon to you and everyone else. So first and foremost, I think it requires putting justice, equity, and diversity and inclusion at the top of the organization's mission and values. And that goes for every environmental organization. So not simply as a side mission, but we need to put those as priority values and goals within an organization. One of the most important things is that organizations need to understand that there needs to be a culture change. There needs to be a change at the very foundation of an organization for this to occur. Until you start making a culture change, you are not going to have that kind of environmental organizational change, and that change will not happen within the environmental movement. So it also means practicing those values on the inside as well as on the outside. So is your staff representative of the communities disproportionately impacted by climate change? Is your senior leadership diverse and inclusive? And what about your boards? It's not simply enough to have a seat at the table, but if that seat doesn't come with any power, there's not going to be a voice. One of the most important things that we can do as an environmental movement within organizations is to give people of color a voice. For too long, I, for one, and so many others have sat in rooms, for example, when you look around and you see a group of 40 different individuals representing organizations. And as I look around, I've noticed in the past, even recently, that I might be one of the only, if not two of the only people of color in this room. And what are we talking about in those meetings? How does climate change impact people of color? How does climate change impact these communities? And when you look around and you don't see anyone from these communities, we are failing ourselves as an organization and we're failing the entire movement itself. I would finally say, don't expect one person of color on your staff or your board to be the sole person who needs to speak up on these issues. So solidify feedback from different stakeholders and communities, get well-rounded suggestions from other organizations. So it's going to take lots of organizations to actually work on this issue. No organization can do this alone. No leader can do this alone. It's going to take the entire movement to be able to move the ball forward.
Thanks, Andres. Yeah, I think we all agree there's a ton of work to be done on that front, and many of the environmental groups that we work with, including Ocean Conservancy, are taking a hard look at ourselves and how we can be better at this. Let me ask you about the other side of the coin. We need to take a hard look at how the people who are currently in the tent are incorporating justice and diversity. I think there's also the question of how we make that a bigger tent. So not only are communities of color disproportionately impacted by climate change, as several have already noted, but polling shows that communities of color have higher rates of support for climate action despite not typically being engaged by the climate community. Similarly, ocean stakeholders across the board are feeling the effects of climate change in a very direct and personal way and have the potential to be an incredible voice for climate action if we can engage them. So Andres, if we could successfully mobilize these kinds of groups, what impact do you think that might have on the climate effort writ large?
So another great question, but I think that they've already started to mobilize themselves. I mean, take a look at it and take, for example, the Sunrise Movement, which is a grassroots youth-led organization working to fight climate change. Take a look at the impact that they've had on youth throughout the country and throughout the world. It has not been a long time since they started their mission, and look at the impacts that they have made. So you see already large impacts happening throughout the country, throughout the world. I think the question is more, how do we collaborate with these groups? And so one of the things that we've been doing at Green 2.0 is finding ways to collaborate with youth, with indigenous leaders, with leaders of color, and making sure that they're not only working with us, but that they're working with groups across the spectrum and working on goals that can help the entire movement. So I think that there are already groups doing wonderful work, and it's making sure that we're all working with them and staying in conversation to find out how we can all achieve the goals we need to.
Thanks, Andres. And I think I have had my chance at peppering you all with questions. So why don't we go ahead and turn to the audience Q&A. We've been seeing a ton of great questions come in. So let me look at our notes and pick out our first question. Our first question is for Janice, for you, from Margaret Cooney for the Center for American Progress about Climate Action and the Pandemic. Margaret, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to thank Ocean Conservancy for putting together this talk and for all the panelists. This is a really important conversation. So Janice, to point out the elephant in the room, we're currently in a pandemic and not only looking at massive public health fallout, but also massive economic fallout. I can imagine that it will be those two issues, public health and the economy, that will probably be at the top of everybody's mind next year. So I'm wondering if you're worried that climate solutions and ocean conservation will basically take a back seat at a moment when we really clearly need immediate action to address the climate and ocean crisis.
Margaret, thank you. That is definitely an issue that we have grappled with a lot internally, and I would be being disingenuous if I said I didn't worry about it. I will say, though, two things. One, it's really on all of us to make sure that that doesn't happen. And because of that, I am optimistic that it won't. Public health and the economy are absolutely going to be an important focus, but public health and the economy are not largely distinguishable from climate change and climate impacts. And impacts on people and impacts on communities. And so I think that there are opportunities as we are thinking about how to rebuild the economy, how to invest in public health, to actually turn the corner on some of these things that have been really difficult for us to turn the corner on, because we haven't had the scale and level of investment and federal dollars and government dollars going towards these kinds of things. So there are infrastructure and research investments you could make in greening our ports, on building clean shipping technologies, on siting offshore wind that could simultaneously tackle greenhouse gas emission issues, create really good jobs, and also result, you'd have better air, you'd have better water for marginalized communities. And so there is, I'm not going to look at COVID and say that it's an opportunity, but I am going to look at rebuilding efforts and say that that is an opportunity for us to rebuild a different future. And it's an opportunity that we wouldn't have had without sort of the economic and health fallout that we have had. So we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to our communities and to the world to actually look at where we are and to make sure that where we are making those investments, where we are doing rebuilding, we're rebuilding in that new model that we all know we need to be to. We can really accelerate the transition using this as a lever.
Thanks, Janice. Let's go to our second question. This one's for Sue from Joshua McBee at Climate Advisors about the need for global climate action. So Josh, go ahead. Josh, we can't hear you if you're talking. Okay, let's skip Josh for now and go to our next question. Janice, we're going to circle back to you. We have a question for you from Alexandra Grayson about private sector engagement. Alexandra, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, so my name is Alexandra Grayson. My question is that I know Sue mentioned that integration was working well for the United States, and I would agree with that, and that amongst agencies that this is true. But how could these agencies include the private sector in their climate solutions and strategies?
That is a great question, and I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists on that as well. Private sector has a huge role to play. If you look at shipping, for example, since I've been focused on that a little bit, you are seeing some of the global shipping companies actually make commitments and help accelerate and lead the transition to getting to zero emission vehicles. And so The private sector is going to be a really important engine for the innovation that we need to see, and a really important driver with the potential to accelerate some of these transitions. And so I think there is a significant role to play there, and we all need to think about the policy environment that needs to be in place to sort of facilitate that role. And the last thing that I would say about the private sector, and just observe that as we are talking about federal policies and all the things that we can do at the federal level to accelerate this transition, to create a more just and equitable energy system, to think about all of those things, the private sector has a huge lobbying power that they can apply to that policy environment too. So in addition to actually being actors when it comes to emissions and being able to really invest in new solutions, they are also actors when it comes to advocacy for policies. And so that's another place where I think we can really see the private sector step up to embrace the crises that we have in front of us and help us get to that blue-green future that we all need to see.
Andres or Sue, anything that either one of you would like to add on that point? It's a really interesting question. Sue, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that one of the innovations of the Paris Agreement was the extent to which it engages the private sector and other sort of stakeholders. They can't literally join the agreement. It didn't break new ground in that sense. I mean, the Paris Agreement is still like your traditional intergovernmental agreement, but I would say the Paris outcome more broadly sort of went beyond any agreement I've seen in terms of not only allowing companies and other stakeholders to take on commitments and have them kind of reflected and get credit for them, but kind of enable the process of the Paris Agreement at the international level to engage directly with the private sector. And I think that's here to stay. In the U.S., there's been kind of an explosion in private sector commitments, in part because of the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. But I don't see that going away, even if the U.S. Ends up rejoining Paris.
And I would just add, obviously, with the private sector, partnerships are key. And so working with the private sector, build those partnerships, working to utilize, as Janice mentioned, what they bring to the table and what their voice is. I think that when nonprofits and the private sector can join in that kind of a partnership toward positive goals, that's the best outcome.
Great. Well, Andres, let me go back to you with our next question from Chris Robbins, who wants to ask both you and Janice about the potential for bipartisan action on ocean and climate solutions. Chris?
Yeah, thank you all for having this important discussion. So, legislative solutions to ocean issues have often been bipartisan, and we've seen that the ocean has been a unifier of sorts for members of Congress on some issues like ocean acidification, marine debris, et cetera. So Janice and Andres, I'm wondering if you think the ocean has the ability to be a unifier on climate issues across political lines as well.
Janice, would you like to start off and then I'll take it, or it's up to you?
I will go with absolutely. That is one of the secret superpowers of the ocean. In my opinion, when the select committee report came out, many of the legislative solutions had bipartisan support. And there are a lot of examples out there. The Blue Carbon for Our Ocean Act that was introduced by Senator Murkowski, who's a Republican from Alaska, and Representative Bonamici, a Democrat from my home state in Oregon. And that bill really focuses on the ability of wetlands, mangroves, and those other blue carbon ecosystems we've been talking about to sequester carbon, and identifies restoration priorities for blue carbon ecosystems. And so the ocean has a really powerful track record of unifying Republicans and Democrats. And it's already starting to do that on climate issues now. We see that replicated in the ocean acidification realm as well. And Andres, part of that is from a lot of the excellent work that you've done in the past as well. So I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that it can absolutely be a unifier. I mean, when you look at the ocean and some of the things people don't think about, whether you're on the left or on the right, You're looking at the restaurant industry, you're looking at tourism, you're looking at travel. All of these things don't have a blue or red. What they do have is an interest from members of Congress to bring to their state, to continue to work with small businesses, with larger businesses, and that is unifying. When it comes down to it, the importance of how well a state is doing for members of Congress, for the senators, for representatives, that's top on their issue. How are their constituents? Do they have work? Do they have a job? Are there things that their state, that their county is producing, and is that continued? When you start to see the decline in that, whether it's with food, with restaurants, with tourism, everyone, no matter if you're on the left or if you're on the right, is going to start paying attention, and that will unify.
I would love to see more of that in the future, and I agree on the ocean front as an ocean partisan here. Why don't we go back to Josh McBee's question, which was for Sue. It sounds like Josh's audio has crashed, but I will read his question on his behalf. Sue, we know the most important thing for the ocean is to phase out GHG emissions. The US has been insufficiently ambitious, but it's not just the US, it's also other major emitters. What do we need to see happen diplomatically to achieve the vision of the Paris Agreement?
Well, that's like, I could talk about that for 5 hours, but I guess the 1-minute version would be countries need to raise the ambition level of their nationally determined contributions. That's something that was supposed to happen this year. You know, when Paris finished in 2015, most countries had 2030 targets. So the idea was there should be a way station, you know, between 2015 and 2030 where countries sit down and like at least consider upgrading their commitments. Because of COVID, that's effectively slipped. And now the time frame is probably closer to 2021. So I think it's an important test for the kind of the viability or vitality of the Paris Agreement, whether the major emitters can, you know, get their acts together to increase ambition. So that's kind of point one. But I think point two would be, I think a lot more has to be done to outside the context of the Paris Agreement for a couple reasons. Paris can't do it alone. The targets, or not the targets, but the goals are too ambitious, right, to just be done under one agreement. You need the help of every other kind of, not every, but many other international forums in the world. Some of them because they have the expertise as opposed to the Paris Agreement. You know, if you're going to engage in fossil fuel subsidy reform, for example, you can't really do that under the Paris Agreement. You don't have the right expertise. Some of the issues have been affirmatively sent away from the climate regime elsewhere, like aviation and maritime, which we talked about. And in some cases, you've got something really important in the Paris Agreement, but it hasn't been operationalized in the agreement itself. And I'll just mention one of those, which is aligning financial flows with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. That's about like all money changing hands. And so, you know, that has to be handled in multilateral financial institutions, in the private sector, et cetera, et cetera. That can all be done under Paris. So I would say it's kind of two steps: inside Paris, outside Paris. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sue. And we'll go from one really hard question to another one, and this one is for whoever on the panel wants to tackle it. From Aurora Colazo of the Packard Foundation. She wants to ask about how we can address the trauma of injustice while collaborating with diverse groups on oceans and climate. So Aurora, you're up.
I think you kind of asked my question for me, but I, you know, in working in partnership with movements like the Sunrise Foundation or the Sunrise Movement, as you said, Andres, and a lot of other movements, Green 2.0, how do we address communities who have been severely impacted by things like police terrorism while trying to collaborate on these issues?
Well, I'll kick it off. Well, thank you for that question. Again, like you said, Ann, no easy question there. But I think that the most important thing is for organizations, for leaders of organizations, to step in front and make sure that they are not only talking with communities, but talking with their staff, that they are not looking the other way or waiting for this to go away. We need to tackle this head on. We need to be addressing the issues and concerns facing our nation. because they face each and every one of us, no matter what our role is in the environmental movement. And so to look away or to not take this issue head on and not to have leadership on this issue is the worst thing that we can do. And it's irresponsible as an organization and as a movement. And one of the things that makes me so proud is looking at how Ocean Conservancy is taken on a leadership role, and how Janice and her team have stepped up on these issues and talking with them over the last few weeks. It's just remarkable. And other organizations should look at Ocean Conservancy and the way they're handling this and stepping up and saying, this isn't something we're going to sweep under the rug. We're going to be working with frontline communities. We're going to be working with communities, whether they're on the coast or inland. We're going to be working with our staff and making sure that they're aware and that they know that this is a concern, not just for the country, but for our organization, and that they make their staff aware and feel like it is something they do care about. So.
Andres, thank you so much. I actually don't know that I have a ton to add to that, but to really appreciate Aurora, the question, because I do think that the world that we live in and the impact it has on the communities we care about, the staff that we care about, we can't not look that straight in the face while we're trying to do other things. And so figuring out what people need, asking the question, and not just assuming everybody's focused on the same crises at any one point in time, I think is really important. We are very focused on listening and learning and being of service and deploying the tools and the assets and the privilege that we have in ways that are effective and can help support and lift and focus on those broader issues at the same time that we're trying to achieve the conservation mission. And I just don't think we can pretend. Somebody else said elephant in the room in the context of another question, and there are lots and lots of elephants in the room. And this is one that is not, we can't do what we need to do in the world, and we can't do what we need to do from an ocean climate perspective without supporting people. So that's a huge emphasis, and we're still figuring it out and learning as we go, and we'll make some mistakes and we'll fail. But we're absolutely committed to that path.
Well put by both of you. I think we have time for one last quick question. We have laid out a very challenging agenda for ourselves, both in terms of what the policy solutions are we approach and how we create and implement them, and who we get to help us pursue them as partners. The last question is for Janice and Andres from Vicki Golden of the Inland Ocean Coalition about how we engage people who are not along the coast in ocean climate solutions. Vicki.
Hi there. Yeah, I love this, and we've been following this whole topic, and we have 16 chapters in the country. Most of them, or majority, are all inland. And what would be the most compelling components of what we covered today to really engage that untapped potential for getting people living in the middle of the country involved?
I will say, when I talk with folks about the ocean and ocean climate impacts, there's this sense of the ocean still as this inexhaustible resource. As long as the waves still work, as long as I can buy fish in the grocery store, the ocean is okay. And ocean climate connection has cracked that open, and I think has made much more plain and clear that the health of the ocean affects you regardless of where you live. And it's really the connection, I think, to weather systems that tend to be the most cogent thing that everybody is living on a regular basis. I'm calling in from really smoky, unhealthy air quality out here because of the wildfires, and those kinds of climate impacts are the ones that we see really galvanizing folks. And the Inland Ocean Coalition, I'll just give a shout out. It's a fantastic organization. You do a lot of really remarkable work. I will say the other upstream connection, the other inland connection that we see a lot is around plastic, and around the recognition that sort of everything ultimately drains to the ocean. So even if you're in a in an inland system, the kinds of pollution that move through riverine systems, whether it's plastic pollution, whether it's fertilizer, a lot of those things bring a lot of awareness in interior parts of the country about the connections that we all have to water, and how much we need healthy water systems and how important the ocean is in that role as well.
That's terrific. And I'll just add two quick things. It's about education, as you all very well know. Educate, educate, educate. Let folks know, let your staff know, let your communities know how this impacts them. But I'll leave you with this: youth. Let our youth know what's happening. Give youth the education and the information so they have the power and the knowledge to move forward and work on this environmental movement together and grow up to be great environmentalists, to work at organizations and are powering the next set of young individuals to be the leaders that we need to keep working on these issues.
Those are great words to close us out. Thanks, Andres. I think we are now officially out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation on how we can work together to move the ocean climate agenda forwards in 2021 and beyond. Thank you again to Representative Castor and all of our panelists here today for bringing your vision and your expertise. We are truly grateful. All the materials we've mentioned during the webinar today will be available on the Ocean Conservancy website and emailed to you after this event. That includes the action agenda for a blue-green future that Ocean Conservancy put together to serve as a guidebook for federal action. We appreciate everybody taking the time to be here today. Thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.